Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar on the role of HR navigating COVID-19. I am Jincy George, and I'm a learning consultant with Ahria. Before I hand over this webinar to Terry Gillis, who is the host for today, I would like to share a few things around the logistics of the webinar. We have a lot of you on call today, therefore we've put people on mute just to avoid background noise of any sort. However, we do not want the interaction on this webinar to be impacted. On the bottom of your screen, you will see three icons. You will see one for question and answer, one for chat, and one to raise your hands. Please use the chat window to share your thoughts, ideas, any opinions that you may have. You can log your questions in the question and answer window. And we will take all the questions at the end of the webinar. We are okay with staying over time if we have to answer those questions. You can also raise your hands in order to participate in anything that Terry may have for you during the webinar. So you can probably use the chat window right now. It gives you the option to send your chat to the panelist or the panelist and the attendees, and you can choose the one that suits you. And in the question and answer, for question and answers, we will keep all questions anonymous, so you can ask away. We will not be sharing the names of people who ask those questions. Yeah. Over to you, Terry.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jincy, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'd just like to start off by saying that we changed our name back in September of 2019, and we inserted HR into our name. Little did we know how incredibly pervasive that would become in a short period of time. Nonetheless, we are here today to help you, your organizations, your employees. We'll try our best that we can to give you up-to-date information that, quite frankly, is changing rapidly. This is a very fluid environment in these very challenging times. I do have to make a note and caution everybody that what we're providing you with today is not legal opinion. It's not meant to replace any legal counsel. It is primarily sharing information as best that we understand it with respect to various changes that are taking place, like I said, in a very rapidly changing environment. Information is changing daily. There's absolutely no question about that. And I think the piece that we all have to keep in mind about that is that you're going to make mistakes. Mistakes are going to happen, and that's okay. And we're advocating that people take a balanced approach to this. There's no really one right answer when one day to the next things are changing as rapidly as they are. We'd also like to remind people that this is a time for trust and not a time for confrontation with employees. People are scared, people are fearful, people are nervous, and emotions are running high. And it's a time for all of us to step up and recognize that people are in a different state of mind, and we need to respect that. I'd also like to give a shout out to our friends at Tech Alliance who are co-hosting this with us today, in order to get as much of this message out to as much of the community as we possibly can. In any situation like we find ourselves in now, I think that the key to anything is communication. And we've heard it 1,000 times, but communication is more listening and less talking. And as we navigate through these HR challenges and we look for answers to these questions, I think the key piece is to continue to listen. I know that here at Ahria, we've been doing a lot of that in the last several days, trying to gather as much information for this particular webinar and as much information as we can for our customers. So here's what we know. As of today, there have been responses both at the federal and Ontario level with respect to HR challenges within organizations, challenges with respect to employees, challenges with respect to organizations navigating through what is quite frankly unprecedented times. The federal government, as I'm sure you're all aware now, has instituted an international travel ban. The border is closed to non-essential travel. Today, the border between the United States and Canada, the world's longest undefended border, is now effectively closed except for trade, which is just incredible. There are some changes to employment insurance. I will be talking about those in a little bit later. But essentially what those changes mean, as best we can tell from what was announced today by the Prime Minister, was that there will be immediate access for those employees who are impacted by change. There's also some other pieces with respect to EI called an emergency care benefit. We'll talk about that a bit later, but the government is moving quickly to shore up people who may be impacted or their employment may be impacted by this. With respect to the province of Ontario, they obviously yesterday, the Premier announced a state of emergency, which allows the government to mobilize resources quickly. And they're also currently in consideration of Employment Standard Act changes, which they hope to pass shortly. But keep your eyes on that. Feel free to come over to Ahria's website, Ahria, AHRI.ca, where we'll be keeping that information up to date for you. So where are we? A couple of things. Despite all of the commotion and chaos that exists, we still have to be mindful of the work that has been done over the years to put into place good legislation to protect our organizations and to protect our employees. And one of those that has been a hallmark of what I consider to be great employment or employee protection is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's an obligation under that legislation to ensure that every employee in every work environment is safe. You must ensure a safe work environment. And under that act, exposure to coronavirus is considered a hazard. Employers have to show that they've exercised due diligence in ensuring that the safety of their employees from hazards at work and possible exposure can be considered a hazard. So that's kind of the principle of the Occupational Health and Safety Act as it pertains to COVID-19 or the coronavirus. So how does this apply in the situation? Well, one thing that has been pretty much mandated, and I think everybody is in lockstep agreement on this one, is if you're returning from travel, you self-isolate, you self-quarantine for 14 days. You have to, as an employer, make sure and take every precaution that the workplace does not get exposed. If you have employees who are returning from holiday or returning from travel, they need to self-isolate, and you need to ensure that they're doing that. Also, what happens in situations like this is a lot of misinformation. You know, I was commenting the other day that in the history of humankind, we have access to more information than we've ever had before, but there's a lot of misinformation out there, so we have to be very careful. For example, if an employee from a manufacturing facility, and some of you out there may be in that situation, comes up to you and says, hey, I've been exposed to somebody who told me that they had the virus, then we need to confirm that the information is correct, and then to address whether or not that person will self-quarantine and whether there's a risk in the workplace that he or she has or might create a risk to other employees. That's a duty under the Act. The other thing that comes into place, before we move on, the thing about the Occupational Health and Safety Act is I would say to everybody, just err on the side of caution. You can't go wrong if you're erring on the side of caution. When all this works out, and it will work out, we will get to the other side of this crisis. We'll be able to fix up any mistakes we may make along the way. It'll be fine. But in the context of that, let's err on the side of caution. And if you have any questions at any time about any of that, of course, the folks here at Ahria are standing by. What comes up under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, of course, is the opportunity for employees, or not the opportunity, but the choice of employees to refuse work. They can refuse work if they feel it's unsafe, and exposure to the virus may be construed as a safety issue, as I mentioned. There's a real chance that some of your employees may panic or overreact. They may say they won't come to work because they're worried about getting the virus, which in itself is effectively work refusal. And while employees have a right to refuse unsafe work, it has to be based on a reasonable assessment of the risk. So the employer has to look into it. At this point in time, we would suggest that what you'd want to do in this situation is ensure that you involve your joint health and safety committee. For those that do not have a joint health and safety committee, there is information available on that. The legislative requirement changes, but depends on the number of workers. If you have less than 5, you're not required to have one. If you have between 6 and 19, you're required to have at least one person. If you have between 20 and 49 and above, you need a complete committee. involve that joint health and safety committee or involve that joint health and safety person. And at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is assessing the risk. We have to assess the risk and minimize all risks. So remember that managing our workers' fears and their concerns is a big part of this. We're trying to avoid panic, try to deal with each situation as it comes along. Let's face it, employees are scared, and we need to work with them and be open and honest and talk to them honestly about the situation. Also keep in mind that anything to do with work refusal is a lengthy process under both federal and provincial legislation, so do the best that you can in the circumstances. This is not normal times. We don't have 3 or 4 weeks for external investigators to come in and check these things out. So again, err on the side of caution. The other one that comes up here, of course, is the Human Rights Code, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. We need to keep in mind anti-discriminatory or anti-discrimination provisions in the code. We have to make sure that our employees are not creating a poisoned work environment for other employees. Without being political, but I think, you know, the President of the United States referring to this as a Chinese virus would probably violate that code. We need to be absolutely mindful of the human rights that are associated with a crisis like this, and there is the risk that that could create a poisoned work environment, and we don't need that or want that to happen. So the other component part that you need to be looking at is your contractual and your legal obligations. There are, of course, employment agreements with every one of your employees. You're going to want to review those. You're going to need to review your own policies. Some of you have in-depth policies, some of you may not have any at all. If you don't have any at all, you have to go to the Employment Standard Act or the federal legislation. If you do, go to your policies. There are common law provisions that do come into place here. For example, constructive dismissal does start to rear its ugly head if things aren't handled properly here. It's very important to get anything right that you do, get it right. As an employee, you may end up constructively dismissing them. There's also privacy laws. This one is huge. We need to keep matters private. For example, I heard the other day somebody say, oh, Fred at work has COVID-19 and he's self-isolating at home. That could be construed as a breach of privacy. We need to keep privacy front and center. And then the other component part that you may need to be aware of is there are statutory leave entitlements under the Employment Standard Act. Employees are entitled to various leaves. We won't get into those details, but if somebody does come to you and say, I'd like to talk to you about some statutory leaves, you need to be aware of those. There's a lot here, folks, I'm being honest with you, so I don't expect you to remember all this, but I do want to highlight the parts I think are most important. Two primary questions that we've been getting here is, what about alternative work considerations, which Jinsey talked about on our webinar yesterday and is available on our website in a recording, and time off due to COVID-19. So we're going to talk about each one of those in turn in the 15 minutes or so that we have left. The first one with respect to alternative workplace arrangements, again, going back to the health and safety of employees, talking about social isolation and distancing, and quarantine, what do those involve? So if you have a temporary workplace closure due to COVID-19, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. If you're a unionized environment, your collective agreement is going to be your best friend. If you're a non-unionized environment, you will be doing the best that you can and working with your employee groups to determine what options are available to you. The most pertinent option that is being considered by most workers right now, or most employers right now who are not in a manufacturing base or customer-facing business, are remote work scenarios. So those can be considered, and again, we talked about that yesterday. The other thing that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, because I think this is important, is coping with change. Your employees are going to be going through a lot of change. I would lean on your employee assistance programs if you have them. I rely on any career transition firms you may be working with, any coaches you may be working with, any counselors that you may have relationships with. Your employees are stressed. Your employees are fearful. And I know that for a lot of businesses, that's going to potentially be added cost. But this is a time when your employees may need that level of service. So just to point that out, especially as we move to workplace closures or virtual work. So we did talk yesterday a little bit about how to handle remote work. I just wanted to mention a couple things as it pertains to human resources. The first one is to consider, is remote work even possible? For example, a lot of organizations are saying, hey, we need you to work at home. Do you have a computer? Do you have a network? Do you have a scanner? Do you have a printer? What about your internet line? It's all the while so folks can self-isolate and social distance, but we still want them to work. Employers may need to consider any expenses that get incurred by the employee for setting up a remote or virtual workstation. And obviously that's going to be within reason. If somebody orders a $5,000 desk from Staples to set up a home office, that might be considered unreasonable, but getting a router or a printer may not be. Also, you have to consider things like confidentiality and cybersecurity. Many of us work with confidential files. I know here at Ahria, we do. We're very mindful of keeping our documentation that is being passed electronically confidential and keeping our security at its top levels. We've been doing that for years, and we will continue to do so. Double check your cybersecurity and your confidentiality with respect to your own networks. That would be very critical. So, time off due to COVID-19. Couple of things to mention there. Generally speaking, if employees who are unable to work, generally speaking, you do not work, you don't get paid. However, our employment and collective agreements like sick leave do come into play here. If you have a sick leave provision, they can take that. Your policies will provide you guidance. Also, any past practices may be important here. What have you done in the past may be a good source of information or guidance on how to move forward. And as always assessing the risk of the situation at hand. Excuse me. So, sick time. One of the questions we've been getting from employers is, can we force an employee to take sick days? Well, in a unionized environment, I tread very carefully because the collective agreement will typically set out how those days are used. If you force an employee who's been told to self-quarantine to use them, that would likely result in a grievance from the union. One would hope maybe not in these situations, but they would have the right to do that because sick days are an employee benefit, meaning it's up to the employee as to when they use them and not the employer. The more likely approach here is that employees who are sick would use the sick leave days they have and then apply for sick leave benefits if they have them. Same with the non-unionized employees. If they're sick, they would apply for benefits if available. However, if there are no benefits, it might be an unpaid leave from your work. Just announced today by the federal government was the emergency care benefit, which was 2 weeks of EI benefits to cover if you are ill from COVID-19, if you are in a quarantine, or if you're in self-isolation and you do not have access to sick benefits, you can apply for the emergency care benefit, just announced this morning by the Prime Minister. If you are in a workplace that does not qualify for EI, or if you're an employee that does not qualify for EI, the government has also announced today the COVID-19 EI benefit that will be made available to workers. So the federal government is really stepping up here to ensure that nobody is left behind. So, sorry, I should be moving these slides forward, my bad. Handling sick days. So a couple of things here you want to consider. First of all, is it sick or is it afraid of being sick? Does the employer require a sick day? There's a difference between asking for a sick leave because they feel they might be exposed and they're afraid to come to work, and someone who's actually ill and might have been exposed. If they've been exposed, the sick leave policy would kick in if you have sick leave benefits. Employers, really check with your insurers on this. This is where your benefits brokers and benefit providers can be incredibly helpful to you. And again, if not, there are sick leave benefits like the emergency care benefit announced today. That's the federal law that will help. And then there are options depending on the health of the business. Many businesses that we know of are down, and they are in tough positions. They're in tough cash positions. There were some announcements today by the government to help with those organizations, but nonetheless, they may not be in a position to top up sick leave or pay. And remember, anytime that happens, that's coming off their bottom line. Many organizations are going to be trying to operate with fewer employees. So, at this point in time, it really is dependent on the health of your organization, what you do. And that's going to have profound implications going forward. But we need to be mindful of the fact that some businesses may be really struggling. And I think that's part of the reason why these benefits were announced today by the federal government. In terms of EI or sick leave benefits, workers with no or limited paid leave benefits, that was announced today. You can apply for up to 15 weeks of insurance. If you can't work for medical reason, that's already in the Employment Insurance Act. So that is what they're just bolting this emergency leave onto. And as mentioned earlier, the employees will be getting EI for an entire 14-day quarantine or self-isolation. Before all of this COVID and coronavirus hit, this was the provision in the code. The eligibility is you cannot work because of a medical condition. You've lost 40% of your usual weekly pay, and you've worked 600 hours in the year before. That's the eligibility that was on the books. So if you meet that criteria, your employees meet that criteria, no problem. And if they don't meet that criteria, there is the other benefit that we mentioned earlier. So the other interesting thing that's coming up is historically there was a condition or a provision that you had to provide a doctor's note. That is being waived, thankfully. I think our healthcare professionals are a little busy. As it is, they don't need to be writing notes. So that is being waived. Those that self-isolate, of course, are eligible for the EI benefit. And the key here that the minister announced yesterday and was quoted as saying, they're really trying to move to a place where there's a minimal amount of effort required. I think that's going to be good news for all of you folks out there that run payrolls and are dealing with having to fill out record of employment for Service Canada. They're really trying to minimize the amount of effort required. So I think that's a good news piece for many of you who may be struggling with that. So this brings us to our last piece of information, which is for many of you, you may be considering a layoff versus a leave. This is obviously going to have a dependency on whether or not you're in a unionized or non-unionized environment. A unionized environment, you're going to want to look at your collective agreement. I can't stress that enough. Work with your union representatives to determine what options you have and what options you can work together and solve together. In non-unionized environments, the advice that we're receiving and hearing is not to call it a layoff, but rather a leave. The code here would be because of a shortage of work if the business shuts down. Also, that if you're downsizing, some employees that on the record of employment, you would use the letter K or other, and with a commentary of downsizing due to COVID-19. If somebody is self-isolating, the record of employment would say K, other, self-isolating due to COVID-19. If the person is ill, it's a medical leave, COVID-19 in the comments. And the goal really here is to be as accurate as possible for the person at Service Canada. I can't imagine how busy those people must be as well. So like anything, the more we work together on this and try to help each other out, I think we'll get through this quite fine. So just keep in mind that Service Canada is going to be very busy. Service Canada is going to have a lot on their plate. So the more we can do to keep things easy for them, the better off I think we will all be. We did want to leave some time for some questions. I know this is throwing a lot at you. If for those of you in human resources on the line, you know that this is what we've done in about 25 minutes is about 3 massive books on code and law and whatnot, and that you usually do to press flowers or something because they weigh a ton. So we've tried to do that in a short period of time. I'd like to end by just reminding everybody to keep calm and wash your hands, and keep calm and self-isolate. Those are 2 great new mantras for the times we find ourselves in today. So at this point in time, I'd like to thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Tech Alliance for co-sponsoring with us. We do have another webinar tomorrow on leadership through turbulent times. This would be great for those that may be struggling as leaders in your organizations right now, trying to determine how to move forward as best that you possibly can, to share some ideas that we know have worked really well in similar situations historically. I'll be honest, we had to update, but we brushed off some information from the last market crash of 2008 and updated that information. it worked well then. I'm quite confident it will work well in this situation as well. We hope you'll join us for that. We will take some questions. We will also are going to be continuing to offer webinars on a go-forward basis. We'll have more information about that tomorrow. So, a couple of questions. One person's asking, what about employees who go off for childcare? Is there code for that for Service Canada? I don't know the exact code. Whenever in doubt with respect to Service Canada on an ROE, my default is always to put K other and then write in the comment section. I would say childcare due to COVID-19. And if that's wrong, Service Canada will let you know. But I'd be pretty confident that that's going to suffice in that situation. Somebody else had mentioned, more of a comment than a question, that don't forget EAP and counseling workplaces are under stress as well. So that's a very good point. So let's be mindful of the fact that people who are providing services are under stress as well. So everybody's under stress, and we just need to be mindful of that. So some other people are asking, what about keeping employee spirits up while they're working from home? Well, I can tell you one of the things that I had a lunch meeting with somebody scheduled. They may actually be on the line, and we decided that we're going to have lunch on Monday, but we're going to have virtual lunch. And what we're going to do is we're going to share each other's lunch with each other virtually, share what we're having. You know, one of the things that I admire about the human spirit is we're incredibly creative and incredibly inspirational beings. And I'm sure, you know, having fun, you know, it's tough times. I get that, but it's still, we can have some fun. So we're going to have a virtual lunch. If other people have ideas, put it in the comment box. We'd love to hear those. We'll share those with everybody. I think, you know, when we talk tomorrow, join us for that in terms of leadership through turbulent times, in terms of helping to motivate people. One of the things we are definitely considering for next week's webinar is one on resilience. So that would be a good one. So good for that. Are there other questions? Jinsy, are you gathering anything?
Yes, Terry, I think I'm seeing a question that says, we are allowing some work from home, but other positions are not able to because of technical issues.
Right, sure.
Someone returning from out of country, not actually sick, but self-isolating, may want to be paid.
Yes,
not fair to others that are working.
Yes. You know, and this is, we had a conversation with a couple of our customers over the last couple of days. You know, this is where, you know, we're going to get into some back and forth and some people saying, well, it's not fair that Freddie Glick went away on a cruise and came back and now he's self-isolating and he's getting paid, and I'm having to work and I'm getting paid. I get all that. I would ask for people to, as always, empathy is an incredibly powerful tool to be used in this point in time. It puts you in an awkward position. I would argue, as always, you're always trying to do the best that you possibly can for your employees, given the situation. You're always trying to do the best, given the circumstances that we're in. And, you know, when all of this is over and done, we can work things out, whatever that may mean. So, so many questions. So, and again, you know what? As I started this work, we're not going to get these. We're not going to get every answer right. We're not going to get the answers to every question right. We can only do the best that we can. Somebody's asking, is it okay for a whole department to be on leave, but for others to stay working, admin staff, for example? You know, the question is, it okay if that's what needs to be done to keep the business solvent? If that's what needs to be done to keep the business operating, then that's okay. But again, as always, we need to keep in mind what's the goal here? The goal here, I think, for everybody is to make sure our employees are well taken care of, and to make sure our businesses are well taken care of. And we'll get through this. So, other questions or comments? This is very good. I'm hoping that this is helpful for everybody. Somebody's asking, what's the difference between self-isolation and quarantine? Self-isolation is when you think you might be at risk. Quarantine is when you've been diagnosed with COVID-19, as I understand it. Okay, so somebody else is asking, is there a time when we should consider putting staff on leave? Is there a reason to wait or do it sooner? No, that's completely based on business forecasts. You know, if your business is starting to evaporate for example, retail, restaurants. There's some businesses that just simply have no business. If you can put your staff on a leave to keep your business whole, then do it. I don't think I would be waiting. But again, it's a case by case basis. With some working from home, others are thinking asking for extra pay because they're actually at the workplace. Again, that's a situation by situation or case by case analysis. I can get their point. It all comes down to each individual business. I don't think there's necessarily a rule or policy in place here. But nonetheless, I think, a couple of things that I take away from all of this is, some organizations, I know that I do work at a university, and the amount of policy that exists at a university, they were able to execute their playbook unbelievably well. They had policies that were, again, probably the size of an encyclopedia set, but they had almost every circumstance covered off, including this kind of crisis, which was kind of interesting. So maybe a reminder that when all this is said and done, we may need, some of us may need to be updating some of our policies, but it doesn't help us now, but it's a comment to keep in consideration for the future. So, okay.
Terry, we have one more question here. How would you approach things if someone says they have immunocompromised person at home and they don't want to come into work and risk it?
Again, that would be, I think the piece there is that that's a health and safety issue, is that's where my brain would go, and they feel at risk, and therefore, that's a legitimate concern under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. If you force them, say, no, you got to come in, they could then say, I'm refused because it's an unsafe work given my condition. So, in which case, I think then either your leave policies would take effect, and or they could then go to the benefit that the government announced today, the emergency benefit. So either way, I think that they would be taken care of and not have to come into work. So just to reiterate, those two announcements today by the federal government was the emergency care benefit. And that's for people who are EI eligible. So if this person who is immunocompromised is EI eligible, they can apply for that. For those that are not EI eligible, the COVID-19 emergency support benefit. Essentially the same thing, but just two different names to cover two different scenarios. So the other thing too, if you have specific questions, we are offering 1.5 hour consults for free to talk through it with you. So feel free to reach out to us. We do have a team here. We're busy, but we're still hanging in here to answer all your questions, and we have time. So some of our other work that we normally do has been put on hold, which allows us to conveniently be able to address any concerns that you may have. And again, we would do that for absolutely free for half an hour. So feel free to reach out to us. So. Lots of different questions. Another one here. Can you force vacation time during an office shutdown? Again, if it's a unionized environment, I don't think you can. If it's a non-unionized environment, I would talk to your employees, and it depends on your situation. If you're an organization that's tight for cash, you might say, hey, listen, we're tight for cash, rather than you keep your vacation, how about we do some horse trading here? You take a week and I'll pay you a week, whatever. Again, creativity here would probably be the answer. But I don't think you can force anybody to necessarily do that. So lots of questions. So I'm not sure we're going to get to them all, and I'm not sure that we have all of the answers that you're looking for, but we will do the best. If we do not have an answer for you, if we haven't answered something well for you today, please get in touch with us. We will hunt it down. Like I said, we've got a team here that's looking for stuff to do in terms of, well, we're not looking for stuff to do, but we're looking for answers to questions. We're voraciously curious about things, so we're getting answers constantly, and always looking out for everybody. So feel free to reach out to us if we're not getting it right, so, or at least not answering your questions to the extent that you might like to see them answered. So anything else, Jinsey?
No, I just see one somewhere here. It says if people take leave just because they can, is discipline Domination appropriate?
I'm not sure that I would be getting into that right now, but I think that would be a conversation that would happen when this is all said and done. But yes, let's be honest. There's always a bad apple in every basket. There's always people that are going to be opportunistic. I just got today, for example, some phishing schemes through email. There's some bad characters among us, and some people that will always try to take advantage of tough situations. Sadly, those people do exist. Hopefully they don't exist in your organization, but nonetheless, there may be those that will play the system, play the game. At this point in time, I think you've got a lot of other people to take care of, if that's what they want to do right now. And let's worry about that later. That would be my take on things. I'm sure other people have different opinions. That's more of an opinion question than a direction question. But at this point in time, you've got a workplace, you've got an organization, you have to do everything you can to protect it. Prioritization is important here. I wouldn't personally, I wouldn't be getting really focused on something like that just yet. There will be a time when you can deal with that. Okay, so again, so we're going to probably cut it off now because we're trending into 40-minute time frame. We promised a half an hour. Again, if anybody has any questions at all, feel free to reach out to us. We're here. hello@ahria.ca for our email. Our telephone number is 519-642-2612. That number again, 519-642-2612. And we have some of our employees virtual, some of us are still in the office here, skeleton crew. We have access to that 24/7. We'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. So I'm going to pause there. Wish you all well. Hopefully we'll hear you or have some of you back on tomorrow for leadership in turbulent times. Some great tips on how to address some of the questions were raised here today with respect to keeping spirits up and engagement up and cultures in place and all the good stuff. So we will see you, or we will have a conversation tomorrow at 2:30. We'll look forward to speaking with you then. Bye for now.